I think it's safe to say the sight of these two working together is enough to send shivers down the spine of the US. And we've seen so much in the news over the last few weeks around the petrodollar, BRICS nations, Saudi Arabia, and whether or not this is the end of the US dollar. In this video, that's what we're going to discuss, but we're also going to ask the bigger question. Is this the end of the US empire as we know it? And what does this mean for us as investors? There's quite a lot of data points to get through, so let's get going. In order for us to talk about the petrodollar, we have to go back to 1944 and talk about the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 was spearheaded by Richard Nixon, and that was the juncture at which the US dollar got pegged to gold. Now, the peg back then was $35 would buy an ounce of gold. And this agreement was essentially the one that gave the US dollar the status as the world's reserve currency. Interestingly, it replaced the pound, which currently held that position prior to 1944. Now, when you are a world reserve currency, it is really important that you have a stable economy, and generally speaking, there is no concern over your fiscal health. Now, fast forward from 1944 to 1960, the US was fighting in Vietnam, and there was a lot of concern over the fiscal health of the United States. And in 1971, 11 years later on, there were quite a few countries that began swapping their paper dollars for gold, going back to the gold standard. Now, Richard Nixon recognized this and basically closed the gold window. And in 1971, this marked the moment where we entered the first fiat monetary system.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
It was a very, very bold call to make in 1971. And through 1972 and 1973, there was a lot of concern within Washington around the sustainability and the strength of the dollar because it was no longer backed by gold. And that takes us to 1974, when the petrodollar system was essentially introduced and the agreement with Saudi Arabia to sell oil in USD came into force.
I have mentioned to you, Mr. President, I have the conviction that all our Arab brethren are desirous of and are seriously looking forward to improve the relations that bind them to the United States of America in ties of friendship and respect.
Now, interestingly, this again was spearheaded by Richard Nixon. And under the agreement was that in exchange for the Saudis selling oil globally in USD, what the US would also offer them in exchange is sale of weapons and also protection, security for their oil fields. Now, at this junction, does that not sound like something out of a mob movie? I mean, is it just me? I mean, it sounds something like...
But anyway, we're here to introduce something called protection money.
Okay.
Which is basically a deal where people with power, like us, protect completely powerless people like you.
Now, under normal circumstances, that kind of stuff would be illegal activity. But hey, look, governments are involved in this. They make the rules, so it's fine. Okay, moving on. Now, under this agreement, what the Americans were able to do with the Saudis is cement and maintain the global demand for the use of dollar, to maintain that world reserve currency status. Now, interestingly, as part of the deal, and this is the genius bit about the petrodollar deal and the system, is that the Saudis were required to invest some of their profits into US Treasury securities. Now, US Treasury securities are a way for the US government to raise money to fund government spending, which, let me just repeat how genius this is. You're getting a country to sell oil, their commodity, globally in your currency, and you're also getting them to invest their profits into your treasuries securities so that you can use it to fund government spend. Genius. This happened in 1974, and throughout 1974, other countries who are oil producing countries also joined the petrodollar system. Now, Historically, any country that has tried to deviate from the petrodollar system has been dealt with very, very quickly and very, very decisively. A prime example of this is Iraq. On September 24th, 2000, Saddam Hussein decided or announced that he wanted to start selling oil in euros, which would effectively break away from the petrodollar system. In 2003, we know what happened.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Iraq got invaded, they secured the oil fields, they moved the oil transactions from petro-euro back onto the petrodollar system. And the USD has been an integral tool that American government politicians have used to further their own foreign policy agenda globally when it comes to sanctions. You think of countries like Iran, you think about countries like Venezuela. And this brings us on to the BRICS nations. The BRICS nations include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Nations that trade together in a bloc, and they have recently suggested creating a new currency to reduce their dependence on the US dollar for transactions and for trade. And more recently, the events in Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia have only brought Russia and China, big players within that BRICS alliance, together even closer. And in more recent news, there are probably two things that more than anything have sent chills down the spine of the Americans. The first one is Saudi Arabia considering breaking the petrodollar deal and essentially selling oil in yuan, the Chinese currency. The second one is maybe a little more removed, but still is quite an important move nonetheless. The fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran are now talking. If you follow any of the politics geopolitically, this is a very, very big deal because Saudi Arabia and Iran, they haven't seen eye to eye for decades for a lot of reasons. Political reasons, religious reasons, geopolitics, influence within that region. They haven't seen eye to eye. They are now talking. They are now making agreements, and China brokered the deal. And it's even got to the point where both Saudi Arabia and Iran are considering joining the BRICS bloc. This is a direct threat to the US and the US dollar, which leads us on to the most important question that I want to try and answer, or at least demonstrate an answer to in this video. And that is the US empire as a superpower on a decline? Now, don't shoot the messenger. Ray Dalio has been talking about this for a number of years, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you a couple of things that he's been talking about, and I'll link all of the sources down below. Get ready for this because you might not want to hear it if you're American. One of the things that Ray Dalio talks about in Changing World Orders is the curve of an empire. So what happens when an empire is rising, what happens at the top, and what happens when an empire is about to decline. We'll get into that in a moment, but let's have a look at some historical data and empires as we've seen, because the cycle repeats itself across different empires, and what happens is relatively the same each time. So this is the graph. In here you see the Dutch, which did have a world reserve currency status at some point, the UK or the British Empire, which is long-standing. At some point, the UK, despite being such a small island, had a huge influence on the world. But we can see here, I mean, the grey are major world wars. Whereas we can see here, though, through the 1900s, we saw a massive decline. So back in the 1800s, 1900s, there was a massive decline, and this is where we are right now. This is the US. We saw that actually in the mid-1990s is where we saw a lot of growth for the US, but they are since coming down from that point here. Interestingly, in the red, and let me just change my color over to green, we have China. And just have a look at this parabolic rise. Huge, absolutely huge. And this is really, really important when you start to look at the curve of an empire. And this is really, really interesting when you start to look at it from a US point of view. So this is what Ray Dalio submits is what happens at each stage of an empire forming. So at the rise of the empire, he identifies that there's strong leadership, there's inventiveness, there's a lot of innovation in education, and education is a priority, strong culture, good resources, and all of these things we can see in all previous empires, be it the Dutch or the British. At the top, and this is where I'm really interested, we have less productivity. The empire becomes less productive. They're overextended. They start to lose competitiveness. Wealth gaps start to form. Now, this is where I really want to focus in terms of a view for the US, because this is an article that was written on April 9th, so only literally a couple of weeks ago. And this is Robert Reich tweeting that 728 billionaires now hold more wealth than half of American households. And the sources for this were inequality.org, Forbes, and the Federal Reserves. It also goes on to say in this article that Snoop's found that as of the fourth quarter of 2022, 735 billionaires collectively held more wealth, totaling $4.5 trillion than the bottom 50% of American households, which held $4.1 trillion. The source for that was the St. Louis Federal Reserve and Forbes. But look at this last point. Snoops also found that the wealth owned by the top 1% of Americans as of the fourth quarter of 2022 totaled $43.45 trillion as compared to the $4.16 trillion owned by the bottom 50% of Americans during the same period. The source for that is the Federal Reserve. So when we go back to this curve and talk about wealth gaps, this is the 12th step before you start entering decline. Now, what happens when an empire enters decline? Large debts. The US debt at this moment is circa $31 trillion. Printing money. Between 2008 and 2022, the Fed printed $8.6 trillion. That's from the financial crash dealing with the COVID pandemic that we've recently come out of. Internal conflict. Many will argue that the difference and the gap between the political parties in America is now absolutely huge. You can see this in a graph here as well. Loss of reserve currency. And this is what we're talking about right here. So does BRICS, or will BRICS, and the potential that the Saudis might sell oil in yuan in opposed to dollar, breaking the petrodollar system, actually mean the end of the US dollar? My honest opinion to this is no. It isn't the end of the dollar, well, at least not today. And what does this mean for us as investors? Does this mean that we should be panicked about our investment portfolio? Should we start to diversify away from the US? I don't think so. I think if anything else, BRICS represents competition, which if you are working in a fair market is only going to be a good thing. And it is possible to have multiple reserve currencies at any one time. We've seen this through history. So maybe this is just a juncture where we will have a secondary reserve currency. But from an investment point of view, I wouldn't start diversifying my investments away from the US just because of this news right now. If anything, we need to have a look at it for what it is. The US is still the largest economy in the world. And when you start to look at the trends, and this is something else that is worth actually showing you in Changing World Orders, at the decline of an empire, Ray starts to posit that certain things start to fall off a cliff. And in this graph, you're going to see here that you have competitiveness, economic output, you have innovation and technology, trade, reserve FX status, military, education, financial center. If you look at this graph specifically for the United States, and you look at it for the last, 20 odd years or so, starting at the top of the 2000s, everything is declining apart from this line right here. And that line correlates to the financial center. And that is specifically talking to us as investors, which has a lot to do with the dollar still being the reserve currency, but more importantly about the US still being the largest economy on the planet. Now, there are sources and reports and talk, and there has been for a long time, that China will become the world's biggest economy, overtaking the United States by 2030. Some people are positing that it will be sooner. Some people are positing that that will never happen at all. And I believe that it will. I think that China will overtake America at some stage. But here in the now, as investors, I don't see any reason to panic. The important thing for you to do is to make sure that you're diversifying your portfolio. You're not putting all of your eggs in one basket. You are most definitely looking at a global approach to the way that you're investing, because exposure to China and emerging markets is going to be an important part of your investment strategy and your philosophy. And more importantly, being aware of the risk that this basically presents. But as I see it right now, this is not the end of the dollar. At least not today. It may be in 10 years, in 12 years' time. And if the dollar is going to be no longer the world's reserve currency, it won't be something that will happen overnight. We will see the signs coming. And believe me, you can bet your bottom dollar on this. The Americans are not going to take this lying down. And I guarantee you right now, they are strategically plotting what they need to do. Part of this will impact quite largely our investment journeys and our investment portfolios. Taiwan immediately comes to mind, and that is a very strategic point that even China are looking at securing right now. That's a completely different video. What I would love for you to do though is tell me what you think in the comment section below. Do you think this is all hot air? Do you think that this is all just clickbait, people wanting to get you worried, wanting you to get out of your investment positions? What do you think? I would love to know your perspective. Thank you so much for watching this video.